All right, guys, today we're going to look at Chapter 2 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the full title, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's kind of like Shakespeare titles. We say Romeo and Juliet, but then the full thing is The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet. We're going to look at a little bit of Chapter 2. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but maybe a couple paragraphs at the beginning to introduce. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in somber spirits and sat down to dinner without relish. It was his custom of a Sunday, when this meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighboring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. That sounds like the beginning of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went into his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. The will was holograph, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. It provided not only that in the case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, M.D., D.C.L., L.L.D., F.R.S., etc., all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor Edward Hyde, but that in the case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay and free from any burthen or obligation, beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. So after that extremely long sentence, let's pause and make sure we got it. First of all, holograph in this context does not mean it's a 3D projection or something. Holo means self and graph means writing. So the will was holograph means the guy wrote it himself. He did not have a lawyer, draft it up professionally. He just wrote his own document. Dr. Jekyll is not dead, by the way. They're talking about a will of something that was prepared in advance, of course, like every will. And this was transferred to the lawyer, Mr. Utterson, after it was written. He did not put it together, as it seems that he might have been kind of uncomfortable with it. So it says, hey, if I die, then the stuff goes to my friend. That seems pretty normal. But the other thing is it says, if I disappear for 3 months, then go ahead and give everything to Mr. Hyde. He can step into my shoes, meaning he can have the house, he can have my, property and so on. That is pretty weird, and that's the thing that Utterson is very confused about, especially now that after Chapter 1 we heard this story about Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Hyde is apparently terrible. He's violent, and everyone just instantly hates him when they look at him. And people almost think that, like, maybe he's blackmailing Jekyll. Maybe Jekyll owes him one for some youthful crime. This document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name, of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes, and out of the shifting, insubstantial mists that had so long baffled his eye, there leaped up the sudden definite presentment of a fiend. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe. And now I begin to fear it is disgrace. So again, he thinks something's going wrong with Jekyll. Maybe Jekyll is, caught up in some organized crime, or who knows what. But maybe he's being forced to pass this on to Hyde out of some duress. With that, he blew out his candle, put on a greatcoat, and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine, where his friend the great Dr. Lanyon had his house and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he had thought. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subjected to no stage of delay, but ushered direct from the door to the dining room where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman with a shock of hair prematurely white and a boisterous and decided manner. At sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. The geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling. For these two were old friends, old mates both at school and college, both thorough respecters of themselves and of each other, and what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. Chapter 1 talked about how Mr. Utterson would kind of be a friend to anybody if he had long enough exposure, and even if they're very different or even if they're bad guys. But in this case, it seems like Utterson would have liked him anyway from the beginning. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. "I suppose, Lanyon," said he, "you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has." "I wish the friends were younger," chuckled Dr. Lanyon, "but I suppose we are. And what of that? I see little of him now." "Indeed," said Utterson, "I thought you had a bond of common interest." "We had," was the reply, "but it is more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind. And though, of course, I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and I have seen devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash," added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple. "What of a strange Damon and Pythias?" This little spirit of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They have only differed on some point of science, he thought, and being a man of no scientific passions, except in the matter of conveyancing, he even added, "It is nothing worse than that." He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure, and then approached the question he had come to put. "Did you ever come across a protege of his? One Hyde?" he asked. "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, never heard of him. Since my time." That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro, till the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. So I'm going to stop here and you can read the rest, but it's basically saying that Utterson is curious about Hyde because he thinks Hyde is not just a normal friend of Jekyll. He thinks, maybe Jekyll owes him from some criminal incident in the past, or maybe Hyde is threatening him in some way. But there's no way that good old respectable Jekyll would leave all of his stuff to this ugly, strange, violent man, especially with that weird caveat about, oh, by the way, if I disappear, it's fine, just give everything to Jekyll. That seems like something that would have been written with a gun to his head. So it's weird because we know, right? We have heard the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and you kind of have an idea of how they relate. Although, like I said, it's not exactly how you imagine. If you watch, recent movies or something, it's often shown that Hyde is a monster, a big werewolf guy, when in fact he's described in the story as kind of small, in this sort of hunched over goblin stance kind of way. There's a lot to the idea that we don't think of Hyde as a person. We think of Hyde as like some, Freudian monster. But this is before Freud, and this is before any of the other mad scientist stories that we know so much about now. This is treated as a more psychological thing, like in Edgar Allan Poe, or other sort of gothic horror tale. So keep that in mind as we go, and check out that assignment I posted on Classroom.